only I could make him understand. I just don't see things the way he does. I don't see how cards that do such wonderful things can be bad. Look at these cards, aren't they neat? Wouldn't you think my collection's complete? Wouldn't you think I'm the girl who has everything? Look at this stack, treasures untold. How many wonders can one shoebox hold? Looking around here you'd think, sure, she's got everything. I've got shoe drops and cantrips aplenty. I've got board wipes and big threats galore. You want combat tricks? I've got 20. But who cares? No big deal. I want more. I want to be where the people are. I want to see 'em drafting, passing around those, what do you call them? Oh, packs. Flipping through jank, you don't get too far. Packs are required for drafting, playing, choosing my card. What's that word again? Pick. Up where they walk, up where they run, up where they choose a pack, one pick one. Wonders untold. Wish I could hold a cube of my own.
I think so. I think I did a great clap.
Love to hear it.
One hand with the other. That's what I nailed it right.
Yes. Hello and welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Andy, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony. Nailed his first and last Enchant Worldle in 4 Maddox.
It's good to be here. Really, really proud to be the victor of Enchant Worldle.
I was trying to think of, was there ever like a sports athlete or somebody that like did the thing, won, and just retired? Like if I was a rookie in like, you know, the NFL or something, and I won the Super Bowl my first year, I think I would just retire and be like, that's it. I only win Super Bowls. That's all I do.
I don't think so, because I think that it takes a ton of work to get to that point. And then most people that are that driven don't just want to quit immediately.
I don't know. It'd be a pretty good bit, though. If you consider how good of a bit it would be if they did that. They would get to retire having won 100% of the Super Bowls that exist that happened during their career.
Is, from your and I perspective, they would probably have made enough money to live a more than comfortable life after that one victory, right? But
exactly.
No,
that's what I'm saying.
No, it's not how
for
people
sure.
work.
And think of all of the sponsorships you get afterwards for being the person that won 100% of the Super Bowls, you know?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Priceless. So is that really the only game of Enchant Worldle you have played? The one where you got the thing in 4 without using Scryfall?
I opened it up today and then I thought, no, not for me.
Today was much less fun. You would have not gotten it in 4 today. I would argue today you would not have gotten it without Scryfall. I definitely couldn't get it without Scryfall. What we're talking about here is a little game by the Draftaholics and Gas MTG, which is like Wordle, which I know a lot of people were playing when that was the latest sensation. But instead of guessing a word and it telling you if you have the right letter in the wrong place or the right letter in the right place, you're instead guessing a magic card, and then it tells you if the type, subtype, year printed, set, color, and mana value, it tells you whether those things are, close to being correct or correct, and you have to kind of narrow it down from there to try and get the actual card. Very difficult without Scryfall. It's so hard to just, if I say, hey, name an uncommon green enchantment, it's like, I don't know I can do that off the top of my head. It's really hard once you narrow down those parameters, actually just think of cards.
Yeah, I got really lucky with my one because I managed to narrow it down pretty quickly to It's one in the past, so we can say it was a 3-mana white enchantment that was uncommon, and I was like, it's surprisingly hard to just recall in this totally different way than you're used to some kind of information. So just thinking of a 3-mana white uncommon enchantment was weirdly hard.
Right, you probably know the name of like 3 dozen of those.
Right,
if
you
I
showed
were to
me
show
even
you,
just like
you would
the
know the
illustration,
mechanics.
or you showed me the name, then I could tell you the whole card. But just doing that recall in a way that you never actually do in a real game of Magic, or a way that you interact with Magic, is weird. But I guess it happened to be a pretty iconic card, and that was great. It was a lot of fun.
And then you retired. 4
And
guesses,
then I
and you're
retired.
done. Walk away, never do it ever again. On this week's Lucky Paper Radio, we are touching on an important topic, Anthony, that I think comes up for a lot of people that maybe don't have a cube yet, but would like to have a cube. And that is how to make a cube from your existing collection of cards. As opposed to, going on Cube Cobra and refining some list or borrowing someone else's list and then trying to get the TCG card optimizer to actually put the 400 cards you've put in your cart into some reasonable combination of packages. Instead of doing that, you can just make a cube for whatever cards you have on hand right now, probably, if you've played Magic almost at all.
I see this question get asked all the time. People are looking at their, shoebox of old bulk rares, or, maybe their well-curated collection that they've been collecting for years. And they've heard about Cube, they want to give it a try, but they don't want to just go take this, like you're saying, this best cube, this most popular cube off Cube Cobra. They want to build something that's their own from this list. But it's a really difficult question to answer, because you're, by necessity, answering a question that's unique to each person of how do you actually turn that shoebox of cards into a cube.
Yeah, everyone's got a different shoebox of cards. And I would argue, Anthony, for everyone that's asking that question, there's probably a couple other people that I think should be asking that question, but instead maybe think they can't make a good cube from the cards they happen to have on hand, or they don't think that it's possible, and they instead think they have to order a bunch of new cards and have to have specific cards on their list for it to be a fun cube, which is definitely not the case.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you can, obviously, if you're pulling from the entirety of all Magic cards to design your cube, you have ultimate flexibility. So in a sense, it seems like you could make the best cube, right? Or you would need the full palette to make the best cube. At the same time, if we just set aside this idea of even if there was this theoretical best cube you could make, what is the best thing that you could do with that shoebox of cards? And I would argue it is absolutely build a cube or some kind of sandbox environment to turn that box of random cards into a game that you can play and get a lot of joy out of.
It's that, but it's also that I really think this is the best introduction to cube design. If you've never designed a cube before, I think just starting with what you've got and learning how to make an environment that plays in a way that you're happy with from that raw material is so much more approachable and easier than trying to start from scratch and put together a cube of your own design from the ground up, because it's so much harder to do that. And people oftentimes get, kind of paralyzed by the indecision of like, oh, what archetypes am I supposed to support? And what should my mana fixing look like? And having a lot of those questions kind of answered for you by the cards you happen to already have allows you to focus on maybe the more simple questions of like, how do you make this a game you actually enjoy?
So I think it makes sense for us to talk a little bit about why this is really a powerful exercise. What are some of the difficulties and challenges with building a cube from your own collection? What is actually sort of the opportunity and the successes, and what sort of unique experience you can have? And then talk a little bit about actually a process of how you might take that box, open it up, and start putting it together into some kind of cube.
I've already got an answer for that last one, but I'll save it until we get there.
So I think the biggest asset you get is just that when you're designing a cube from your collection of cards, you're working with a limited palette, a limited set of things, which is, we always say, restrictions breed creativity. And I feel like we almost say that too much. So maybe it's lost a little bit of its meaning on some of our listeners. But it really is such a powerful thing for all creative exercises to say, you don't get the opportunity to build from everything and like look for the highest peak in this entire range, but let's focus on just one limited aspect of this set and try and build something great. And I mean, without this kind of idea of building within restrictions, we wouldn't have Caesar salads or automobile, because we would have just looked for a faster horse, or whichever way you want to take this. Creativity has always been fueled by necessity, and that's no different than when you're trying to design a cube.
You really lost me with the Caesar salad and the automobile metaphor, but I was following you up until then.
Okay. I mean, if you just said, this is the best salad we can make, and if we have these ideal ingredients and you guarantee everybody else has access to them, everyone would just go make the best salad, right? But it was just because in, some hotel, somebody had this random collection of ingredients. They had some stale bread and some anchovies and some Parmesan cheese, shelf stable ingredients. But because that's the limited palette they had to work with, they ended up making this new, great, amazing salad. And that is so powerful.
Sure, I will trust that that's how the Caesar salad came to be. If you purport to know that, I do think that cube design, broadly speaking, is very rooted in the idea that restrictions breed creativity. I would argue you could kind of call cube design just game design with the restrictions of the existing pool of Magic cards, right? We're all kind of designing our own game, and what we're doing is doing that within the restrictions of the framework of Magic, right? The game system that is Magic. And so restricting yourself even further, it's not like you're doing something different, right? It's the same thing. You're just working from a different pool of raw materials, obviously.
Yeah, totally. I mean, just to extend that a little bit further, I think that Magic in itself always has this little element of game design. It's not like Monopoly or poker where you just open up the box, you have your set of playing cards, and you play the game as intended and sort of with the mechanics as intended. There's always some element in Magic of designing your own deck, designing what kind of experience you want to have from it. So Cube and working with your collection is just pushing that a little bit further, where you're just taking a little bit even more agency, where you're not just designing one deck, but designing this entire sort of closed ecosystem within the game. Something else that's great about designing a cube from your collection is it can be a little bit daunting and difficult to sort of focus in and figure out what really interests you about Magic in order to design a cube around it. But when you're designing from your collection, you're often already pulling from the set of cards that you love and have, decided to collect for one reason or another. Whether that means these are a bunch of uncommons that are just left over from drafts of sets that you loved and drafted over and over again, or if it's cards that you collected for decks that ended up taking apart or being replaced by other things. These are all going to be cards that you are familiar with and for some reason or another have ties to. So it just makes it, I think, a much more enjoyable process than just literally having to go through and read a bunch of cards that you've never seen before, but playing with cards that already have sort of crossed some bar for you.
Yeah, I think it's very likely that people, pound for pound, love a card in their collection more than a random card from all of Magic's pool of available cards. But I think it's guaranteed that you have some connection to that card, right? Like, even if you don't love the card per se, it has some connection to your history with the game and what you've played, what you've drafted, the decks you've built, which means that there's going to be these little anchor points throughout your cube, which just make it easier for you to, again, find those little seed crystals to then build off of, and just, like you said, be working with cards that you have a connection to, which means that you're going to inherently have some connection to the cube at the end.
Right. I mean, speaking for myself, a lot of the cards that went into my first cube this is an individual card that I remember 3-0ing my first draft with, and now I just want to capture that little bit of that experience. Not 3-0ing my first draft. I'm not as good at draft as I am at Enchant Worldle, but the first draft that I 3-0'd. Or, this is a card that I bought for some deck and it didn't quite work, but I want to try and make it work in this context. Or this is just a whole theme that was from a set that I remember really enjoying, so I want to try and capture some of that spirit. So there are all these little connections that ended up going into creating my own environment to emphasize those.
I have, I think, at least one of all of the showcase frame Eldraine cards in foil, just because I love that showcase frame so much. And I just this week, I haven't bought cards singles in a long time, but I just this week bought some of the gilded foils from Streets of New Capenna. I just kind of went through and bought the cheap ones that, I thought were somewhat playable to me, or were mechanics I kind of liked, just because that card frame is so pretty. So you out there listening might just have a bunch of cards that you like, a creature type that you're fond of, or, cards you find beautiful. And that's also a valuable thing to add to your cube.
The other thing I want to say about this is building a cube from your collection, or building, a cube that's very personal to you, isn't just an okay stepping stone. It's not good enough until you can upgrade. I think it really is a completely valid exercise in itself. This is one of the wonderful things about Cube, is that it is a self-contained system. So just because maybe you only have guild gates or some other kinds of lands that people wouldn't say these are the most powerful lands that are representative of what high quality Magic is, it's still a completely valid, and because it is self-contained, totally workable game design in itself.
Right, you're not going to take your cube that you built from your collection and then go play it against somebody else who had a much bigger collection who built their cube from it, because you never played cubes against each other, right? Everybody playing your cube is going to be drafting from the same pool of cards and have the same opportunities to spike their draft and do well, whatever that means. So there's nothing that makes that cube lesser than or more incomplete. And honestly, saying you build it from your existing collection is a really good way to curb any questions from your players of like, why isn't this in the cube? It's like, don't have one. You wanted the cube, give it to me. Maybe I'll put it in there.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe you would say, like you're saying, you're not bringing the cube to play against someone else's cube. So whereas if you're building a modern deck or a commander deck or whatever format you're playing, you do want to show up with the most powerful cards to have some chance to win. But if you just really loved, let's say, the Scrylands from a recent set or something like that, and you would like to have an opportunity to play with them, Cube can provide that opportunity.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to hear like Dom Harvey and Ari Lax on the next episode of Dominaria's Judgment talking about how to build a modern deck from your collection. It's not really a thing that happens in metas like that.
So there are a bunch of reasons why this is a difficult exercise, though. One of the biggest ones is just that it is going to be a unique restriction. It's going to be a unique set of pressures and challenges that you don't necessarily have the prior art to leverage. If you were building with absolutely no restrictions, you could go on Cube Cobra and look at the most popular cubes. You can bring it to other players who have designed cubes and ask them their feedback. But when you're doing something totally unique, you don't necessarily have that prior art to stand on.
Yeah, you can just go on Cube Cobra and search for the best cube, and you find mine at the top of the list, and then this cube has been curated for the past 6 years, and it must be the best one, obviously.
Call up Cube Cobra and tell them they've made a mistake because mine should be at the top.
And you say, why is Sticky Fingers in the best cube ever? What is going on here? I gotta cut Sticky Fingers. I don't even think I have it in me to leave it in for one paper draft. I kind of want to, but even in just the decks I've simulated drafted, I keep wanting it to be any other card. I think one of the problems, honestly, is that it doesn't trigger like Young Pyromancer, and you can't flash it back with Dreadhorde Arcanist. It's a weird card type for red. Probably just can put Lava Dart back in, I think.
I mean, it could just create an artifact token, Sticky Finger.
Oh, yeah, yuck. Please never say sticky finger to me ever again.
Okay.
That's my boundary. I'm setting boundaries.
Okay.
The not having any prior art thing, I think some people might think of that as, if I don't want to design a cube, I can just go take an existing one and copy the list wholesale. And that's what we mean when we say referencing prior art and like having that history to build on. But even if you are creating your own cube environment, it's hugely helpful to be able to talk to other cube designers that have played cards in similar contexts and ask them how things perform and what works and what doesn't work. And when you're working with a completely unique pool, a completely unique limitation, you're not going to have any of that at your fingertips. So that is going to be a challenge that needs to be overcome. And you're going to have to make a lot of decisions just kind of based on, what you think makes sense. Your reckonings as a player and as a cube designer that won't be able to be informed directly by other players' experience.
Right, so even if you're not copying something whole cloth, you might still be saying, well, I'm interested in this theme. Let me look how this theme has been executed in a lot of different contexts. Or, what are the green ramp creatures that people value the most in different contexts? So there can be a lot of little exercises and little pieces of knowledge that you can leverage and take from the community, which you don't necessarily have access to when working totally from scratch within this unique set of restrictions. So in addition to you as a designer not necessarily having a lot of prior art and resources to leverage to inform your cube design when you're starting with a unique restriction, your players that are approaching the cube also are going to be in a new spot where they don't necessarily have that experience of having drafted similar cubes to be able to leverage to know how to approach the environment.
In what way is this a downside, Anthony, or a challenge? Like, what does this actually mean for me practically as a cube designer?
That's a great point. I mean, I think a lot of these things, like so much about design, we can say it's a bug or a feature depending on what you're looking for. Designing something with no prior reference is a limitation, but it's also kind of a fun opportunity that you get to do things totally for free. And I think this is maybe a little bit more on the easier to be a feature than a bug. It is a limitation, though, in that players might just have a little bit of a difficult time getting into the format, enjoying the format, knowing just how to approach it, which can be a limitation to get players engaged. On the other hand, playing a new format for the first time can be one of the most fun draft experiences. So I think you're right that this one really does cut both ways.
We did an entire episode of this show dedicated to how to get people to play your cube, which I think is one of the eternal challenges for every cube designer, whether you're working from an eternal card pool or just whatever you happen to have in a shoebox under your bed. That is one of the things that comes up, right? Like people that don't have expectations for what they're going to be doing, don't know if they like it or not. Somebody that knows they love their one commander deck and knows they're going to sit down and enjoy playing a game of Commander with it, it's a really hard sell to convince them to do something that isn't unknown at all. And so that's true, I think, no matter what your cube looks like. And in this case, the fact that if somebody has drafted the Magic Online cube or the Proliferate cube on Magic Online, it's not going to have any sort of bearing on your own environment is another sort of small hurdle, another way that it's even a little bit more novel than perhaps some other cubes are. But I do think this problem is actually kind of universal to anybody that makes a cube. You're going to have to convince people to try something new if they have never drafted it before.
So related to this lack of prior art, it's also just much, much harder to get feedback on a cube when you're building from a collection because players don't...
You're going to get feedback. It might be hard to get good feedback, but I think you're going to get feedback on it for sure.
Or we can just say it's hard to give and get useful feedback on an environment.
If your playgroup is like ours, you're going to get feedback.
And there's a couple specific challenges. One of them is you will get a lot of the cube feedback that I see is basically just talking about individual cards. It's much harder to talk abstractly and think about the proportions and principles of an environment than it is to point out individual cards, which are just an easy touch point to grab onto, which in particular is challenging when you're building from a collection because a lot of people make suggestions about cards they think will work well, and your answer is going to be, I don't have that card, so that's not useful feedback. So what do you think you can do to go get around that and try and actually just encourage getting good feedback and leverage the community as a resource?
I don't know. I always think that just asking more open-ended questions, like you said, almost every player's feedback is going to be, this card beat me, so it's too good. This card was no good when I drew it in my deck, so it's too bad. It's going to be this very atomic level of just, this card made me feel good or bad, and that's what I'm going to give you feedback on. And I like to ask people questions of just like, did you have fun? Did the games feel challenging? Like questions like that, I think oftentimes what you'll get from somebody out of that is actually something that is useful. Like they won't just say, yes, the games were fun. They're probably going to describe what about the games they found fun or what about the games they found unfun. And that's the kind of feedback I think people don't think to give, but if prompted with the right question, you can actually get some very useful input on.
Absolutely. And even if either players or just people in the community are giving you feedback in the form of individual cards, if you can push them a little further and ask why does this card make more sense to you, often that why will still apply even if you don't have that individual card, but you might have other cards that solve the same problem that they are ultimately trying to get at.
I drafted James's Brea cube, one of the players in our playgroup this week, and I fell into this trap. I was just like, James, I want these 2 cards in the cube, please. That was my feedback at the end of the draft. I was like, can I please get a Vidalcan Aether Mage so I can tutor up my Emery?
It is your lived experience, and it is worth that.
It's just a thing that comes to you most naturally, right? Like, when I'm thinking just in my experience as a player, in one night, one draft of a cube, it's like, oh, this deck would have been really great if I had this one card, and here's why. And that's, that's what's easiest to think about. That's what comes first to mind. So it's not, like you said, that's not valuable. It's just that you get so much more of that than you get of other kinds of feedback that oftentimes it's easier to think about encouraging the other kinds of feedback because you'll very naturally just get feedback on specific cards.
Right. So the other kinds of feedback to really encourage is looking abstractly at not just what are the individual cards, but what are the sort of proportions of different effects? What are the ratios of different mana costs and things like that? What are types of interactions between cards that are either potentially unfun or really rewarding? And leaning on what are those sort of more abstract ideas that you can apply to this list of cards, which, let's be honest, you're probably not going to have your whole shoebox of cards indexed in a way that people can view. And even if they did, asking people to give feedback by reviewing, here's the 4,000 potential cards I'm working with is not really realistic. So I think ultimately trying to keep that feedback somewhat abstract is really going to help you leverage the community. The last thing about getting feedback is I would really say, and we touched on this a little bit, but lean on the play experience as much as possible. It's always more valuable to actually get feedback by playing an environment than just thinking about it abstractly. And the more far you get from what are sort of the baseline experiences, the experiences that people are familiar with, the more it gets really critical, more and more critical to actually just have that play experience. So the more you can present your goals, present what the challenges are, and then get real data to inform that, the better. So let's talk about how we would actually go about cracking open that box and building a cube.
That makes sense. That's the subject of the episode, and we're like halfway through, so we should definitely get to that, I think.
Have you ever built a cube by just building with the cards that are in your collection?
I have not built a cube that way, but I did make a conscious effort to build a couple EDH decks that way back in the past when I played a lot of EDH. I'm such a tinkerer, as I think a lot of people that are drawn to cube design probably are, and so really the deck design was like the most fun thing for me about EDH. But I found I was in this like pattern of just designing a deck, ordering the cards for it, or trading for the cards for it, and then like playing it once or twice and kind of being over it, and then having this these cards I got specifically for that deck that were now no longer useful to me. And so I really gave myself the challenge a little while back of just like, if I'm going to make a new deck, let's use all these cards that I already have and like make them useful to me first. And so I do have some experience, at least, trying to parse a big collection of cards and find things that are useful in it, though in the context of a deck, not a cube.
I've done this not 100%, but I feel like with most of the cubes that I've designed, once I have my collection fairly well indexed, so I'll heavily leverage that, and I feel like I end up with like 75 to 80% of the cards are already things that I own, which goes back to the fact that, the cards that you own are largely the cards that you're already interested in and excited about, so building from your collection in 100% mode can still get you pretty close to what you ultimately would enjoy the most.
So what do you do then?
So what I would really encourage anybody to do is sort of try and split the work up into two separate chunks. Think about it like writing versus editing. There's this creative process of let's explore the collection, let's figure out what's interesting, start pulling cards together, start getting some kind of a list. And then once you have some kind of a list together, switch to your editing hat and try and fine-tune, balance, identify problems, and really sculpt the list into its final shape.
Yeah, that's, I think, absolutely the best process and a great model for thinking about it. When I've done this for decks in the past, the first pass is like, I'm just going to go through all my boxes, which are nowhere near as well organized as yours, and I'm just going to pull out anything that interests me at all for the project at hand. I'm not going to think at all about mana curve or if I have too many of one kind of effect or anything like that. I'm just going to pull every single thing that I think might be interesting and might be relevant for what I'm actually designing. And then afterwards, come back with that finer tooth comb and really think about things like the densities of effects.
Yeah, and that can be hard because that little editor voice can show its head a little bit earlier than you want it to be and be like, oh, well, sure, you like that card, but do you need another 6-drop at this point? And ultimately, maybe not, but it can really slow you down and kind of hamper that exciting, creative, and explorative process of just pulling out what's interesting. So I would definitely try and focus on that first. And I would say make an event of it. Like you're saying, grab the collection, start pulling out cards, physically stack them up. I think for a lot of people that are interested in this process of building a cube from their collection, that means from a paper collection. It might mean it's not especially organized, but they want to have that experience with those physical cards. So yeah, make a day out of it. If you can bring other people in to help you out and comb through cards, that'd be even better.
It has to be said, too, that actually manipulating physical cards at, your kitchen table or whatever is so much better than staring at a computer screen. I think many people have jobs that are largely just staring at computer screens, regardless of what sort of field or industry you work in. Not everybody, obviously, but a lot of people. And so to have a hobby that is not also just staring at a screen, actually getting your cards out and holding physical objects in your hands and reading text on a piece of cardboard, I think it just makes it feel more ceremonial and more fun.
I mean, it's also just really effective. Like looking at a spreadsheet can be hard to get a sense of how many cards you have and what the whole sort of layout of things is. But having the flexibility to just put cards in stacks, and maybe you stack up, here are the things you're especially interested in. Here's some cards that are kind of on the fence, or maybe you want to start sorting by colors as you're pulling things out, or whatever works for you. Just being able to physically organize the cards is a great approach to it. At the same time as you're going through and pulling out cards that excite you, I would also encourage you to, again, without letting that editor voice get too nosy in there, also just pull out some solid bread and butter baseline effects. So if you see a decent removal spell, a decent creatures that might be helpful just for filling out the curve, whatever it is, sort of basic effects that you can create a separate little stack that maybe is kind of like a resource for you to use later when you go into editing mode, in addition to the stuff that's really drawing you in and getting you excited.
That's a really good point to bring up, Anthony, that I probably would have forgotten, because those are the cards that I'm actually most excited by generally. Like when I think about building a cube for my collection, I'm like, ooh, I'm so excited to come across Disfigure and Serum Visions. I'm just going to put these in the pile over here. But I think you're right that a lot of players would not feel excited or interested in those cards, right? They would just think, oh, well, what I'm interested in are all these cool build around 4 and 5 drops, and that's what I want to make the cube about. And even a cube that is about build around 4 and 5 drops is going to need some of these more common effects to kind of grease the wheels and make the environment actually play like Magic.
Yeah, and if it's you, I would say then the bread and butter effects that you're missing are the cool gold 5-drops that you don't actually want to put in your cube.
Your opinion is that the bread and butter effects I'm missing are various white main line effects and combat tricks. Where are all those in my cube?
All right, is there anything else you want to say about this creative experience of going through the collection, pulling out cards that spark joy?
No, I think the metaphor you've provided is a really good one. And yeah, first step I think should just be pull everything out that might possibly fit or makes you excited or, looks like something that you'd want to take out of a pack.
All right, so once you have this one big stack, or maybe you have a stack of the cards that you really love and a stack of some more miscellaneous bread and butter effects that you might use as sort of a tool to fill things out. Maybe you've got a bunch of stacks, you've started organizing things by colors. What's your first step in terms of editing?
For me, the number one thing I'm going to look at that point is my mana curve. I love cheap spells, and I think once I'm done going through a stack of cards and picking out all the cards that I like and that are interesting and that are calling out to me, I'm inevitably going to have way more high mana spells that looked cool and fun that actually would be kind of dead in the environment because there'd just be too many of them and you can't play that many of those kinds of effects. So that for sure is the first thing I'm looking at for me is mana cost. Is that the same for you?
I think maybe the first thing I would do before that is start splitting up cards by color and sort of look at the rough distribution there. And then mana cost is absolutely the next thing after that for me. So in terms of colors, and I guess we could also bring in things like artifacts, colorless spells, and lands as well. I think it's easy to overthink how much structure you need and how much balance you need, but I would at this point sort of roughly try to get things reasonably in balance. The hope is, for most cube environments, that you can reasonably expect to draft every color and have a similar chance of success, right? So with that in mind, you'll probably have roughly the same number of cards in each of those colors with some amount of other effects. So I might start looking at what are the colors that I specifically have way too much of or not enough of. And even if I'm not trying to fix that right away, just keeping in mind as I'm continuing to make cuts and additions, try and put a little bit more pressure on the areas with a little too much density and to be a little bit more liberal adding things where there's not quite enough.
Yeah, and I would emphasize that we're talking about roughly in balance. And I think that can be within like 10 or 15% of each other. So if you have 50 cards in one color, I think you can reasonably have as few as 42 or as many as 58 in another color, and no one would ever notice in the draft. No one would say, gosh, there sure are a lot of red cards and very few black cards in this cube, because, the experience of drafting already has this element of unknown information such that people can never actually suss that out. And so I think most players' idea of what roughly in balance means, especially if they've never designed a cube before, is probably a lot more rigid than you and I are imagining.
Yeah, and I think that if we're talking about the mana curves as well, that's something where I think you actually might notice things more, because imagine you have 10% more of one color. Well, maybe just more players are over a number of drafts just going to end up drafting that color, so it'll even itself out and feel sort of natural.
Or splashing a couple cards from it in their
Absolutely,
other color deck, yeah.
If you're, say, really, really light on red 2-drops, then that's something that you might actually feel a lot, where the player that ends up in a more linear red deck often feels like, well, I didn't quite get enough 2-drops to fill out your curve. So in the same way I would take a look at sort of trying to get a sense of where the balance of colors is, I would definitely do the same thing with the mana cost within each color and actually pay a little bit more attention to that.
I think we could do an entire episode on lowering your mana curve and the virtues of doing it. It's something I especially am really, really into. I know you also care about this a lot, Anthony, and there's a couple ways to look at this. One way is that, the cheaper your cards are mana-wise, the more decisions your players are going to have. I think that's pretty universally true. Like, if your more cards are cheaper, that means you're going to have more turns where you could cast 2 different spells, and you get to choose which one. More turns where you get to multi-spell, and you get to choose which combination of 2 spells you're going to cast. More turns where you can cast something on your turn and hold up some interaction on your opponent's turn because your spells just cost less mana overall. And I've found that many, many, many Magic players and cube designers really value those kinds of decisions, and you just get to that point in the game more quickly when your mana curve is lower.
That's definitely true. I think that for a lot of players, that's going to be the experience. And like we were saying before, the tendency is to gravitate to the big splashy spells. They'll put cooler effects on more expensive spells a lot of the time. Although I feel like maybe that's changing lately in the last couple of years, but there's some correlation between how much cool stuff they can do for what mana cost. So trying to lower that in order to get more effects that you can double spell and get more reasonable curves, that is really valuable for a lot of people. To be a little bit more abstract, though, I would just say, imagine what sort of your ideal deck looks like. And if you enjoy playing decks that have a lot of big, here's your deck that doesn't do anything until turn 4, if that's the kind of magic you're looking for and your players are looking for, that is also fine. In either case, I would say imagine what the mana curve of a deck that you would enjoy playing in the environment is, and then try and just take that distribution of mana costs and apply that to the cube in general. And I agree, for you and me, that's going to be generally trending towards pretty heavy in the cheaper spells, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the same for you.
And I would say take that ratio, and if you are going to then extrapolate it to the entire cube itself. I would even if you're leaning a high curve there, I would still like round down to including more cheaper spells, because having more cheaper spells is not a problem. Having too many low cost spells is not really going to be an issue. Having too many high mana value spells is a real problem for a drafter, right? Like they might have a deck that functions a lot worse because they didn't get enough cheap cards. And so even if you are saying, yeah, I want mostly 4 and 5 drops and, just a few 1s and 2s, when you do take that ratio and magnify it up to the entire color of the entire cube, I would still lean a little bit lower if you want to end up with decks that look like that. One other way to think about the value of lower mana value cards, which came up on the Cube Discord this week, is I saw somebody mentioned that, I just noticed I have so many green 3s, but not enough green 4s. Can somebody recommend some green 4s for me? And I pointed out, I was like, hey, guess what? Every green 3 is also a green 4. At every point in every game of Magic where you could cast a green 4 drop, you can also cast a green 3 drop. So if you found yourself putting a bunch of green 3s in your cube, it's because those cards were compelling to you, you thought they were going to be good in your environment, you liked their play patterns. There's absolutely no reason to cut one of those cards you like for a 4 that maybe doesn't speak to you as much because you feel like you need 4s, because those 3s are also castable in that same spot. That's true all the way down the mana curve, right? Your 7-drop is only live once you get to 7 mana, but on that same turn, you can also cast a 1-drop, a 2-drop, a 3-drop, any other card that is a lower converted mana cost.
So we've taken our big pile of cards, we've looked and started to try and roughly balance the distribution of colors, started to sort of fill out the curve of the mana cost in all those colors. And by doing this, we're taking our stack of the maybe cards, the cards that are the bread and butter cards, adding them where we need to balance out areas, and cutting cards and setting them to the side that are maybe a little bit too redundant. But don't necessarily cut those cards entirely. Keep them in the mix. Keep all the stuff that is like potentially interesting even after you sort of design the first iteration of your cube. It's helpful still to have that because you're going to play some games and you're going to want to continue to make changes.
Yeah, I would definitely keep all those cards that you pulled because you enjoyed them on hand, because if there's one universal of cube design, it's that you were going to have a lot of changes you're going to want to make after the first draft, probably.
Yeah, that first draft is going to inform the changes that you want to make more than anything else.
Which is one of the reasons why I think this is such a great way to make a cube, because I've seen so many people fret and worry and like labor over a list they have never played, and it's like, you're welcome to do that. If that design exercise is something that's compelling to you, like by all means, just go on Cube Cobra and edit a list until the end of time. But there's so many people that do that and then don't realize how much all of their perceptions are going to change as soon as they sit down and draft that cube the first time, which anything we can do to get people to that moment sooner is going to really help you level up as a cube designer.
So another thing to start looking at as you're editing, making cuts and additions to try and balance things out a little bit is the distribution of different kinds of effects. So maybe you're looking at your creature curves within different colors, as well as your proportions of different kinds of interaction, whether that's removal, if it's counter spells, combat tricks, if you enjoy that kind of thing. Are there any guidelines you would recommend for balancing those kinds of things, or rules of thumb for what ratios you think make sense?
This is definitely very cube dependent, obviously. I think we could qualify almost everything we say on this podcast with it entirely depends on your cube, and that's certainly true of these kinds of densities of effects. We do it quite a bit. So it definitely depends on the environment. I think it's helpful to give some benchmarks, though, to at least understand kind of the range of possibilities. So I should say that I have designed some very thematic cubes that are very committed to a particular theme. And when I do that, I often don't actually think about the distribution of, for example, removal at all. I don't think I need to get to 15% removal spells, right? I don't think about that even a little bit. I just find all of the removal spells that are on theme and put them in the cube and then play it that way, right? And that means there's a sort of wide range of removal, but all the removal is thematic, and that's a valid way you can do it. If you don't want to think about these distributions, you don't have to. You can just kind of put it in there and then, like we said, see what that first draft feels like. And if you're like, gosh, nobody had a creature removed in the entire, first 2 matches, then maybe you can add more removal or something. But if you do want to have kind of a rough sense of where this stands, we did actually do an entire episode on this topic, Anthony, a while back, which I think both of our cubes have changed a little bit, but I do have those numbers up in front of me. And so, just for rough numbers, my cube, for example, is about 41% disruption. And disruption, I'm including removal of all kinds, counter magic, and hand hate, basically. But that's a huge chunk of my cube. That's like 41%. That's like almost half the cube that is just at that. And in my cube, I also have over 20% mana fixing lands. And so you combine those two, we're already at like 60-some% of the cards, and we haven't gotten to a threat or, a build around card that's really cool. Now, some of these removal spells are threats as well, right? If you think of like a Ravenous Chupacabra style card, that's both. But that's a lot committed to those sort of effects right there, for sure. Your regular cube, by comparison, you have about 25% of your cube is some form of disruption, which is substantially less, but still a much higher number than you're going to find in most retail limited. So that's another comparison point that I think a lot of players have, is what they see in a regular draft of a standard set. And these numbers are, I think, all higher than what you're going to see there. And you have about 15% of your cube, 16% of your cube that is mana-fixing lands. So different numbers there, and our environments definitely play very differently. Just two benchmarks, right, where you can look at. And I would guess that if we were to kind of continue down that spectrum, every set is obviously a little bit different too. Different sets have more removal or less removal or whatever, but they're all going to be, I think, well below where our cubes are in terms of the overall density of these kinds of effects.
And I think you could also take that same heuristic of imagine the kind of deck you want to play, and if you're more interested in playing decks that are a little bit more proactive and based on setting up engines and things like that versus decks that are more about and playing games that are more about lots of interaction and figuring out how to most appropriately value that interaction to remove your opponent's threats, you might end up somewhere on very extreme ends of that spectrum even.
And then the last points I'll give here is that once you kind of factor in a couple other things we considered like bread and butter effects, like cantrips and other kinds of hand smoothing, that brought my cube up to like almost 80%, like 77% bread and butter effects, and your cube was just over 50%, 55% bread and butter effects. These are all the cards that might have been the cards that didn't inherently spark joy for you when you were going through your boxes, right? You didn't look at maybe the magma spray, was not the card you saw and thought, I can't wait to play a deck with magma spray in it. But as we said, for most players, these kinds of effects are kind of fundamental to what Magic is, right? Like some amount of interaction, some amount of mana fixing, some amount of being able to control what kind of spells you're going to draw are pretty inherent to every kind of limited that you can ever draft of a standard set and pretty much every kind of Magic. And so even if these things are not the things that make you excited, they're, like I said, kind of the grease that like makes the wheels turn and makes the decks work so that your deck can do the thing that it's about, right? You only need, 3 or 4 build-arounds in your deck for it to be a build-around deck. Then the rest of it can be these kinds of enablers or things that just make those build-arounds work and function more reliably.
For sure. I mean, you could think of them as the context or the backdrop for the really exciting stuff.
Yeah, and I can say that my first version of my cube certainly had way fewer of these kinds of effects and way more 3, 4, and 5 drops that I thought were really cool and sweet. And through a lot of playtesting, I just came to the realization that, like, actually, these cards just kind of end up riding sideboards a bunch, or, you have a deck full of these 3 and 4 and 5 mana spells, and you just die to anybody with 2-drop creatures because you can't get them online first. This is partially, subjective taste. You might not like to have as many removal spells or cantrips as, for example, I like. But it's also, I think, somewhat universal, having watched a lot of players design their first cube and then make changes to it, that most players end up putting in a lot more of these like cheap kind of bread and butter effects than they initially started with.
Another thing to consider while you're in your editing mode is, in a lot of cases, cubes are designed to have a relatively flat power level. This is another thing which is a whole different topic, and I don't think saying a flat power level, in the sense that most cards are of a similar power level, is necessarily, that shouldn't be a goal in itself, but there are some reasons that does make a lot of sense in a lot of cubes. So just consider, are there cards that are just very underpowered such that they're just always going to be in a sideboard? That's not really making the best use of space, so consider cutting some of those cards. Or are there cards that are just extremely overpowered that even if you really enjoy them, they might end up just taking over games in a way that isn't fun? And try consolidating and coming a little bit towards the middle as you're making edits.
That's definitely valid. I think I personally wouldn't worry about this so much at this stage. You're going to find through experience how happy you are with having various power outliers in either direction. I guess there's probably some extreme examples, right? If you started playing 2 years ago and have only drafted, a dozen times and have a couple hundred cards on hand to make a cube from, and one of them happens to be the Oko you opened in that, F&M event, like, yeah, maybe that Oko is going to be a problem if you're building a cube from a very small pool.
Or let's say you've been playing you've been playing Magic for years and years, and you have a massive collection, and you just have this one Oko you open in an F&M. Maybe that Oko is still a problem.
So there's definitely circumstances where I can imagine extremes where it becomes a problem. But, if you look at the power delta of retail limited, it's huge, right? Like in Eldraine, you can open an Oko, and you can also just open a pack of unplayable rares and uncommons and have to take just some replaceable common for your deck first. And retail limited is fun. People don't often complain that much about the sort of swinginess of retail limited. So while I agree that I think eventually over time, cube designers will naturally narrow that power level band because it does allow for, I think, more agency in the draft and more nuanced draft picks and deck building decisions. I don't think starting at a place where you have a pretty wide power level band is a problem that is to be avoided, right? Like, and if you're on the fence about playing a card, you think it might be too good or not good enough, I would say play it and find out because, again, things are always very different in your mind than they are in practice.
I agree, but I'm going to have to call you out on your hottest take ever. Magic players don't often complain?
I don't know. Like, for example, I see people complain a lot about sealed. Very spiky players tend to be like, oh, sealed all comes down to, how good your pool is when you open it. And to those people, I would say, look at any GP, a limited GP, and who day twos, and shocker, it turns out to be not all the players that opened the bomb mythic rares, but instead all of the really skilled and experienced players. But I don't hear that as much about draft. Maybe I've muted all of the words on Twitter, so I don't see any complaining anymore.
Or maybe it's just there's a lot of bias that the complaints are the loudest voices.
But I think there's this promise in a draft, right, where, like, if you lose to somebody's bomb, there's this promise that, in the next draft, you might be the person with that bomb, right? And so in the long arc of history, right, it's going to come out evenly, right? You're all going to open the same packs over time and have the same opportunities to take these cards. A little variance from draft to draft is not the worst thing. I guess we haven't said, Anthony, that we'd recommend, I think, making your cube as small as possible to start with because there's no reason to have more cards than you need to draft. And so if you're planning on drafting with 8 people, you probably need 360 cards. If you're only going to play with your 3 closest friends, maybe you only need 180 cards. I wouldn't go bigger than that. And there is a byproduct of that, right, Anthony, which is that if you have exactly as many cards in your cube as you're going to draft, then whatever bomb mythic rare you have in that cube, whatever power outlier you have, is going to be opened every time, right? Oko is going to be in someone's deck every single time, which is a little different than having a bomb in retail limited. But still, even with all of that, I would still advise people to not sweat that too much. And it's just the idea of somebody cutting a card they like because they're worried it might be a little too good, that just breaks my heart. Just put the card in there, find out for yourself, see if your players complain about it, rather than just assuming it's going to be a problem.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Something that I think people think about with cube design a lot, but we really maybe conspicuously haven't mentioned so far is talking about themes or archetypes. And that's intentional. I personally don't think that, even in a broader sense, that's necessarily the easiest place to start with cube design, but especially when you're working from a collection, I think that can actually just make things really difficult. If you think, well, I really want to make a deck or I want to make this color pair all about this particular mechanic, you're working with a limited palette, so that might just be really hard to get working. So my suggestion would be to definitely focus on each color in itself and make sure that most of the cards are just kind of functional and reasonable. What I think you'll find will happen is that Magic, as a whole system, has been designed to work together. So the color pairs will still naturally work together. If you just have, let's say black has efficient removal, well, that might pair well with green having efficient creatures. So it's a way to punch through damage, or with blue to have a control deck that has multiple different ways to interact with their opponent's threats. So I would not sweat that and try too hard to lean on any particular themes, but instead just focus on individual cards that you think are interesting.
Yeah, we're basically we're doing a little lap here of, I think, some of our past episodes. We do have an entire episode dedicated to this as well, if you want to hear more about, the pros and cons of really archetypal-driven design. But I agree, Anthony. I would say that if you end up with something that resembles an archetype, right? Like, I can imagine somebody that drafted a particular set, a whole bunch. They have a lot of cards from Neon Dynasty in their collection, and they really like a particular deck from that format. You might find that, yes, you do actually have, a clear-cut archetype or two in specific color pairs, but just make sure that comes from the cards first, right? I think working the other way down, especially from your limited collection and saying, all right, let me first sit down with a piece of paper and write down my 10 two-color pairs and what their themes are, and then not play this Boros card I really like because it doesn't match my Boros tokens theme I wrote down. I think that's a recipe for just kind of getting in your own way and tripping over your own feet. And instead, I would say, take the cards you like, put them together, and I think you'll find, like Anthony said, there's a lot of inherent interactions between cards, right? The rules are eternal, cards always interact with each other in some way, and there's probably going to be some emergent themes and synergies that you're not even thinking about. That'll be a lot of the joy, I think, of putting together a cube like this and playing it.
Yeah, and even more so, again, because you're pulling from a collection of cards that have some intention behind them. If you just love squirrels, you maybe drafted a set with squirrels and always made sure to draft a bunch of them, and you also had a squirrel commander deck at one point and a squirrel kitchen table deck, or, replace that with whatever kinds of themes and interests you've had. And you might discover that there are a lot of even more sort of explicit themes that are going to be embedded in that set of cards, but don't take as much sort of intention and top-down focus to force in.
Yeah. So if you end up, with, your blue-red deck is a spell slinger or artifacts deck or whatever, or you have a Rakdos sacrifice theme. And honestly, Anthony, we joked on that archetype episode that the number of times I've seen somebody post on the Cube subreddit and say, I'm trying to figure out my 10 color pairs. I need help with Simic. Here's what I've got. And they list these exact themes. Blue-white Flicker, red-black Sacrifice, red-green Stompy.
Those could just be,
that's just the color pie. That's just the color pie. That's just,
right. Yeah.
The colors do have identities outside of the set. And so, if you're going to work really hard and eventually just come down to things that are inherent attributes of the color, then it's not worth the effort. I definitely just work cards first, right? Find the cards you like and see what emerges from that. And if you have something that is a more explicit theme, is some sort of text on the card that ties things together, great. If not, I think you're still going to find that you can combine these colors in interesting ways when you draft.
My cube is themed around Magic the Gathering.
My cube is themed around low mana value spells.
Do you have any other suggestions for people that have gotten their rough list together and are trying to edit it and make it shaped to look more like a cube than just a pile of cards?
The last thing we only touched on briefly is I think most cube designers put way fewer lands in the first version of their cube than they should, ? Obviously should is a matter of your tastes, but Retail Limited does not have very many fixing lands, and that is because of a lot of reasons. One of the biggest reasons being that Wizards of the Coast thinks of a booster pack as a product that someone buys and, opens and wants to get joy from, and they know that a lot of players just are not going to have a lot of fun opening 4 fixing lands in a 15-card booster pack. They're going to feel like they got ripped off or whatever. If a booster pack was designed just for Retail Limited, I think we would see a lot more fixing lands in those packs, Anthony. And the reason is because you're going to draft 45 cards if you have a typical draft setup, and you only need 23 to 25 non-land cards to make your deck, and so that leaves a whole another 20 cards, almost half your pool, that is kind of wasted if you don't figure out how to get a sideboard card out of it, or put a card you drafted into a land slot so you can effectively play more of the cards you drafted. I think the reality of a lot of first drafts of cubes is that people include, like a couple cycles of fixing lands or whatever, and then they fill out the cube with all the cards they like. And what happens is over the first 5 or 6 drafts, there's just a whole pile of cards that never gets played, right? It's just the worst 15% of every color just never gets played, right? The blue player has these blue cards they took, but it's not good enough to make their main deck. And so you have this big band of the cube that is just kind of useless. It could be anything. It could be air, and it wouldn't actually have affected any of the games because none of these cards are making main decks. And that space, I think, is so much better spent on just having more fixing, more committal build-arounds, more sideboard cards. And that's a really unintuitive thing, I think, when you are first designing a cube, because it feels like you're putting in too many lands, because it feels unlike any Retail Limited set you've drafted, any booster pack you've ever opened. And, we should say it, most people are not that excited about fixing lands, right? If you go through your collection and you've got a bunch of Guild Gates and Ravnica bounce lands or whatever, you might be like, this is just not sparking any joy from me. But people casting their spells and not being mana screwed, I think we can all agree that sparks joy.
And I think that in most pods of 8, there is 1 to 8 people that actually do really love drafting the Ravnica bounce lands. Those are a lot of fun.
So I guess, if I were to 30-second my tips for a first-time cube designer working with a limited pool, focus on the cheapest spells in terms of mana value, include more fixing lands than you think you're going to need, don't sweat power disparity, and don't sweat color balance, and just put the cards you like together, focus on cheap spells, focus on mana fixing so that you actually get to play with all of them, and then see where that leads you.
One other little detail that I think, especially when we're talking about lands, could be relevant, but could apply to other things as well, is most cubes are singleton, meaning they have only 1 copy of any particular card, which is awesome. It's awesome because it's fun to collect the first copy of a card so much more than the second. Your collection likely already just has a lot of individual singleton cards, so it really just works well with building from your collection.
I have a couple of cubes, Anthony, as you know, and there are some cards that are shared between them, so I have cubes that have the same card in them. And I even go as far as I can't get the same version of a card for both cubes. I have to get a different printing, a different set. I have to get something different because singleton is so great. I just don't want to have 2 exact fungible copies of a card.
It's a weird thing that I don't think we talk about enough, but it really is true. However, I think especially as we're talking about fixing lands and things like that, it's also totally reasonable to break that rule. So if you don't necessarily have as much variety, and maybe you did a bunch of drafts where you have the Ravnica bounce lands, just to use one of my favorite examples of things that might be sitting in people's
We
collections.
could say the pathways. I guess the pathways are more contemporary, you know? We're referencing lands that were printed like 12 years ago.
I'm going to stick with the bounce lands.
Sure, go for it.
It would be totally reasonable to say, well, I'm just going to put 4 copies of each of those. And this could also apply to maybe there is some kind of thematic interaction where you really like this one card, but it needs some redundancy for it to make any sense to build around. You can definitely break the rule and include 3 or 4 copies of that, or 360. I don't care.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I wouldn't have thought to say, Anthony, but I break singleton in my cubes for fixing lands, and the reason is because they really do perform a fungible role in the deck, right? And you could argue that every counterspell is performing the role of a counterspell, and every 2-drop creature is performing the role of a 2-drop creature, but those cards often have mechanical differences that make the singleton feature compelling, right? There's a reason you would take one over the other. With fixing lands, it's almost never the case. You just have better and worse ones, and you're either going to take the better one or the worse one. There's really rare circumstances where there's some mechanical theme that changes your draft pick order for fixing lands. And so, given that those are really just the resource of your deck that allows you to cast your spells, I would really encourage everybody to play with whatever lands you have. And if that's, 4 copies of each pathway or whatever, go for it.
So the last biggest thing I would say about designing a cube from a collection, which we say a lot, but I don't think we can overstate it at all, is expect to iterate. A cube is not just something that you're going to put together and it's going to be perfect once and you're going to play it and never want to make a change. As soon as you play it, especially that first draft, it's immediately you're going to see all kinds of things. You're going to just look at it. You're going to just look at a card in a pack and say, now this feels totally different, and this card feels totally overpowered and busted.
It feels
this card
so
I never
different
want to
once
see
it's in a
again.
pack. It
It's
really
bizarre.
feels so different once it's in a pack. It's wild. But I mentioned Sticky Fingers, which I put in my cube because it's like a 1-mana spell. It does a lot of stuff, and I was curious to see if it could work in my environment. And just seeing it in packs in the draft on Cube Cobra, I was like, no, this is not going to get there. This is not doing it for me.
So just plan for that. Just be willing to say, this is the first draft and we're going to play it. It's going to be fun the first time, but immediately you're going to want to make changes. And that's kind of the joy and fun of designing a cube. And maybe that might mean you're going to move beyond just working with cards from your collection and buy some more singles. Or it might just mean diving back into that shoebox with a new perspective and looking for more particular things.
That is something we should reiterate, is that don't put a ton of pressure on yourself. Magic is fun. Playing with Magic cards is pretty much always fun. And draft is self-balancing, right? If your cube is wildly out of balance and you have way more powerful cards and way less powerful cards and even colors that are way more powerful or less powerful, when you draft, if your players identify that, then those colors and cards are going to be sought after, and therefore one person's not going to end up with all the broken cards from one color in their deck, right? It's somewhat self-balancing, which means that even if your cube is, quote-unquote, all messed up and designed wrong or whatever, it's still going to be fun, right?
What does that even mean?
Wrong for the goals someone had set out, right? If they intended to make a cube that was very balanced in a certain way and it ended up not being, it doesn't mean you're not going to have fun drafting it, because a draft is a self-contained, zero-sum fun time with your friends that doesn't really matter, if any of these things are out of balance, especially the first couple times you draft the cube. You could argue some of these problems do become annoying, the 10th or 11th time you've drafted the cube, but I promise you will have already changed it by then. So don't put any pressure on yourself to get that to the point where you're playing your first game. Should we do a little shout out to, the fact that tons of people are now building sleeveless cubes because of Ristic Study's video on that sleeveless Gonti EDH deck? And if you're not worried about the cards in your collection becoming damaged, you don't even have to bother sleeving them. Just, shuffle them up, riffle shuffle those bad boys, get some basic lands and, wear them in. And you can just play your cube like that. You can build a cube in like an hour that way. Sleeving takes a long time, but you just get those cards together and start shuffling them up. You're good to go.
An hour's optimistic. I almost did this. I went into my basement to my beloved box of junk and opened it up, looked at it, and put the lid back on.
Don't say that, Anthony. You make it sound difficult for all our listeners. We're
It's
trying
not.
to encourage we're trying to welcome them to the wonderful world of Cube.
I'm going to give it another shot.
All right. I hope some of you have been spurred to action and inspired to design and build your first cubes from this episode. We've said a couple times, but I don't think this is like a lesser than or a half-assed way to build a cube. This is a great way to build a cube. It's a great way to get some value out of the collection you have sitting around gathering dust, and you can have a lot of fun drafting these things with your friends and not having to spend money on more booster packs.
Yeah, I can't emphasize enough. It is the best thing you can do with cards that would otherwise just be sitting in a box.
If you do end up making a cube from this episode, you could put it on Cube Cobra if you wanted to. This is a website for managing cubes. You definitely don't have to. Certainly if you're making it from your collection, and you're not working Cube Cobra down, it could be a little bit tedious to then go and add all those cards manually to Cube Cobra. But if you do make your first cube from this episode and you do put it on Cube Cobra, please send us a link at mail@luckypaper.co so we can see what you've put together and revel in your glory. Even if you don't put a list on Cube Cobra, if you make a cube, I want pictures of your draft. Send everything to mail@luckypaper.co. And that's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Check out the show notes for this episode, where we're going to have links to everything we mentioned, including all of these back episodes of our podcast on specific topics. We're also going to have a cards page where we're going to have a visual spoiler for every single card we talked about, which I guess I should have mentioned at the front of the episode, because now you're already here, you already listened, but it allows you to follow along without having to have Scryfall pulled up to pull up cards you don't know.
And I want to give a big shout out to listener Talo. We've been asking people to help us annotate old episodes before we started doing this. That's still an option. If you're interested, check the show notes for a link and how you can help us out. But listener Talo has been tearing through old episodes and adding annotations, so big thanks to them.
I had that on my list too. Thank you so much, Talo. If you're coming to CubeCon, allow us to take you out to dinner, which brings me to Anthony. It's 20 weeks to CubeCon. This is a Cube event that Anthony and I are going to be attending in Wisconsin in October. This event is going to have a bunch of drafts of community-designed cubes that are officially sanctioned, and they are having people vote on which cubes they want to play. So starting June 1st on the CubeCon Twitter account, which I believe is at MTG CubeCon, you can go and vote on the cubes you want to be played in the officially sanctioned drafts at CubeCon. If you also want to bring your own cube or play a cube that's not one of the official ones, there's going to be tons of side events and people just firing drafts of their own cubes as well. So any cube can get drafted at CubeCon, even if it doesn't get in voting-wise.
I'm a little bit nervous. Are people going to vote for my cubes?
I think people are going to vote for your cubes, Anthony. Which ones did you end up submitting?
I submitted both my regular cube and turbo cube.
I know what I'm voting for. It's both of those cubes over anybody it gets paired with. So sorry, anybody that gets paired against Anthony. But
I think there's going to be a lot of great options. If you are not interested in those cubes,
ooh, if you get paired against DSB's Ancient Times, I'm not even sure if DSB is going or submitted Ancient Times, but that's a cube. I really think, boy, it's going to be hard.
Here's what I'll say. I'm not going to bring the turbo cube to the free to play area if it's not one of the main cubes. So if you want to play,
there we go. A little ransom, a little ransom. All right. That's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All our music is produced by DJ James and Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced this week by Anthony and I calling each other remotely because Anthony is ill and talking about Magic cards. Thanks for calling me up, Anthony, even though you're not feeling great this week.
I hope I did okay. I'm struggling. This is what happens if you play Commander. You get COVID.
Oh, dear.
When you're designing with all of one second. Excuse me. Have you ever built a cube just by cracking open a box and building cart with... Jesus. I'm falling apart here. I'm going to drink some tasteless tea. It's helping. Yeah. I think I'm just going to start over.